The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a free and open platform for theater makers worldwide. It's available on iTunes, Google Play, and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Could you make it as the manager of a New York City theater in the 1840s? That's the question that players of the game Broadway 1849 grapple with. Its creator, Dr. Robert Davis, is our guest for this episode. Robert teaches in the Tisch Drama Department at New York University, the English Department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and the graduate program at Hunter College. He's also a contributing editor at Lady Science, an independent magazine focused on women in the history and popular culture of science. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me here.
Can you explain what Broadway 1849 is and how it works?
Sure. Broadway 1849 is, I guess, technically interactive fiction, which is essentially like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, if you remember those things. Although those are, I think, pretty rotten, poorly designed. And I wrote this for a company called Choice of Games, which publishes a lot of this kind of thing. I guess the clearest way to think about it is that it's a multiple-choice novel. It's about 150,000 words long, and you essentially play a character. You get to decide everything sort of about their background, who they are. You can play as gay, straight, bi, asexual, man, woman, gender neutral. And you essentially manage a theater throughout the year of 1849, which culminated in the Astor Place riots. And so you start off and you build up these statistics based on who you think you are, what your skills are. And those statistics get tested throughout the game and ultimately give you several different possible outcomes.
The title, Broadway 1849, can you take us back to that year? Can you explain what life in New York's theater scene is like?
Sure. I guess the most important thing is it was pretty chaotic and uncertain. One of the things that attracts me to that period in the 19th century is that we tend to think of theater as being kind of in its own bubble, culturally speaking. But at that time, in the antebellum period, particularly in big cities, theater was one of the main sort of outlets of popular culture. And where a lot of people's domestic homes did not have parlors and places to congregate, a lot of people, for their basic social interaction, went to the theater. Now, that said, New York was a pretty small place at the time. Like, as a general rule of thumb, if you know the city, Union Square is about the top of where people really live. So it was pretty small. There was not a huge population. So the theaters were deeply in competition with each other. And, survival was really never a given because it was purely a commercial enterprise and you had lots of competition. Since you didn't have a huge audience base, you really had to change your bills a lot. There was some long runs, but a really long run at the time would be like 20 performances, which would be kind of like massive, out of control blockbuster. So things were changing all the time, often every single day. You never really knew kind of what was sort of coming up, and you were always keeping your eye on the other theaters and trying to carve out your own identity. Inside the theaters, I guess, the thing that makes the theater of the time so different is essentially the lack of house lights going down. So, there are chandeliers, the audience can see each other all the time. And because there's not that many people in the city, every social class is going to every theater every night. And so, like in the Elizabethan theater, where you have the groundlings and the people paying for nicer seats, you have the same kind of structure in the 1840s for most theaters. So there's a time when all these different audiences are coming together, and they're often in pretty open conflict. New York in the 1840s was a really volatile time, much like our own era. And so you have this play going on. You have these people socializing with each other. You have them antagonizing the other classes. It's just like everything's happening at once in the theater.
Can you talk a little bit more about the business of running a theater like this? Your game features these really both interesting historical details, but also some kind of fraught negotiations with characters like Thomas Hamblin.
Yes. So I got to say, I love the 1840s. I would absolutely not want to run a theater in the 1840s. Outside of like constantly being worried about money, you got to worry about fire a whole lot. The Bowery Theater, which was around from roughly the 1820s to the 1920s, burned down like 7 times in that period. It was definitely a time of very big personalities that you had to be friendly with, but also completely dominate. You had to get along with your rivals, which is, I think, something that I kind of try to put in there. And at the same time, you were sort of like trying to backstab them, and you had conflicts with the press because the press would be allied or against you or supporting you. Thomas Hamblin famously burst into the New York Herald's office and beat the editor in the office. But Thomas Hamblin is a horrible person and really fairly ruthless in his business and possibly a murderer. But that's sort of lost to history.
Okay, possibly a murderer. You've piqued my interest. I think I need to hear a little bit more about Thomas Hamblin.
Yes, well, Thomas Hamblin is quite possibly one of the most significant theater figures of the 19th century who possibly gets somewhat brushed over because he's not sort of part of the late 19th century drive to respectability like Edwin Booth is. But Hamblin was an English actor, and he managed the Bowery Theater, which really was the first almost dedicated home to kind of working class, what they call blood and thunder melodrama. It's the kind of place that Edwin Forrest really felt like home at. It was also extraordinarily successful. And in a way, I think, put New York theater like on the map. The period that he managed it kind of saw theater get more stable and more like entrenched in American society. He was, however, entirely like an unscrupulous person. I think in the beginning of the game, you sort of meet him, and he's with his wife, Louisa Medina, who is, of all the people in history, if I had to have dinner with one person, it's probably Louisa Medina. She was a immigrant from Spain. She spoke, English, French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, and Greek. And she could do algebra and I think like calculus. And she also wrote. She was one of the first people to really like earn their living by writing. And she wrote particularly The Last Days of Pompeii, which in the game you can produce. And it was really one of the first real blockbusters of the 19th century. She was brilliant. I mean, how he got to her. He was married to a woman. Okay, here's a somewhat long story that's very interesting. So he's married. He has his first wife. And I'm going to probably get details wrong. And a woman came to him, a young woman named Josephine Clifton. And she was like, I want to be an actress. And he essentially was like, okay, fine, I'll put you in plays, but you have to sleep with me. And, it's a time when there's no regular route into the theater. And she apparently engaged in that relationship. But then he just sort of cast her aside when he was bored with her. And she kind of struggled through a lot of her career. And she had to sort of tour abroad as well. He was really someone who would always take advantage of somebody else if he could. And his wife, when she found out about that and some of his other doings, he was a very regular patron of brothels, etc. She divorced him. So he got divorced from her. And then he was taking up with another woman who he wasn't really allowed to marry because of the terms of his divorce, but he called this woman his wife anyway. Anyway, she died, and their nanny was Louisa Medina, so he took up with Louisa Medina. And they started to live together as man and wife. And then a woman who turned out to be Josephine Clifton's half-sister named Louisa Miller, or Louisa Missouri Miller, who is a character that you can romance in the game. She came to Hamblin and she said, hey, Hamblin, I want to be a star. And he was basically did the same thing with Clifton. He was like, okay, you can, I'll put you in a play, but you have to be my mistress. And she was like, okay, fine. And we don't totally know what coercion happened there, but he ended up putting her in a starring role in one of Louisa Medina's plays. And she did very well, apparently. And then it turned out that her mother, Adeline Miller, was a notorious, ruthless brothel madam from New York and Philadelphia. And I don't think Louisa Miller knew this about her mom. But her mom wanted her back because her mom was like, Hamblin is a bad dude. Don't want to be around with him. And when you have like this really evil brothel owner kind of slash gangster being like, stay away from that guy, you know, he's trouble, right? So she tries to abduct Louisa, who apparently like flees to the roof of the building and kind of like in movies does one of these chases where she's jumping from building to building on rooftops. She eventually gets away, and Hamblin goes to court and gets custody of her because she's only like 17. So she goes to live with Hamblin, who she's sleeping with, apparently, and Medina, who's apparently Hamblin's wife, and they apparently get along fine. And then one July, Miller suddenly dies of brain fever, you know, which is that kind of catch-all medical term for what they thought would happen if women got too excited at the time period. So she dies, and that's July. And then in October, Medina dies of very similar symptoms. And from looking at the coroner's report to Medina's death, all the doctors who performed an autopsy are constantly saying, but I swear it wasn't poison. So there's a quite decent likelihood that Hamblin like murdered all these people and got away with it quite fine. I mean, I'm leaving out like a duel and stuff like that, but that's kind of like 1 year of his life.
Yes, you mentioned these big personalities, and there are a number of other really interesting historical characters in here. People like Ned Buntline, Anna Ballard. Could you tell us about some of the real-life historical people that we meet in the game?
Sure. And this is really one of the reasons why I made the game. I think almost every single person in there is a historical figure or comes out of a melodrama. I think that I take some liberties. I don't think Anna Ballard was really like quite that established at the time, but I'm fairly true, I think, to who some of the people are. So Ned Buntline is like the 19th century in all of its contradictions. He was one of the people who was charged with instigating the Astor Place riots, although the degree which he did that was debatable. He was a really big proponent of the American Party, or sometimes called the Native American Party. So he was essentially somebody who hated immigrants, felt like they were taking their jobs, wanted to destroy the elites, and wanted to have America for Americans, which is a fairly familiar sort of political impulse today. But he was also a best-selling novelist, a journalist, and he would go on to essentially create the dime novel and launch the career of Buffalo Bill. But as a good sense of who he is, before he came to New York, there's this, great sequence of events where he's in Kentucky, I believe. He had fought a duel with a man because he had slept with the man's wife, and he had killed the man in a duel. While he was on trial for that killing, the man's brother jumped up and shot Buntline. And instead of hanging around, Buntline jumped out the window and fled. The brother got a posse, and they captured Buntline. And they literally hung him, and he was hanging and dying when his friends came and rescued him. And then he comes to New York City, and all of a sudden, is like this major political and literary star, more or less. There's other people, Abby Mead, who is a prostitute and theater aficionado that you can meet and get acquainted with. She had a very fancy brothel around the time period. Matilda Heron is an actress you can hire, and she's one of my favorite really 1850s actors, because she broke a lot of sort of stereotypes. There's a lot of, part of what I did was just throw in side characters as well. My editor was actually on Jeopardy, and she answered a question about the author of Varney the Vampire, an 1840s early vampire novel, so I threw him in just for fun. It was kind of like this playground of great, colorful characters.
Speaking of colorful characters and the conflicts between them, the plot of the game culminates in the Astor Place riot of 1849. Listeners might be a little bit familiar with this, but can you talk a little bit more about what this event was, how it came about, and why it was significant?
Sure. I'll say, first of all, my pet peeve of history, outside of when people say that the Greeks wore togas, is that it's the Astor Place riots in the plural. The thing about the riots is that it kind of brings so much of the time period, so many of the social, cultural, political tensions together. It's often blamed on a feud between Edmund Forrest, who is in the game, and William McCready, who's in the game, who's a complete jerk. And actually, I downplay his jerkiness. But really, it has this sort of like vast kind of economic, cultural series of animosities that sort of erupted at the time. And really, they begin, like, I believe it was on a Tuesday in early May in 1849, when Macready comes to play Macbeth at the Astor Place Opera House, and the members of the audience riot and I think throw eggs and have banners saying Macready go home. And he's going to leave, but the elite of the city kind of beg him to stay. And they get the poor mayor who had been like inaugurated 3 days before. They get him to pledge to send out militia to guard the theater, which he does, which is fairly unprecedented and really just made it all worse. And Macready performs again later that week. And the same kind of thing happens, albeit on a lesser level inside. But outside in the square, there's thousands of people rioting. And they're rioting because they hate Macready. They're rioting because they hate the British. They're rioting because they hate New York City elite, or the upper 10, as they called them, for the upper 10,000. And there's some of them seem to be rioting just because it seems like a fun thing to do, which, you know, is somewhat very New York. And some of the people who were later killed were just like, heard a commotion and walked down to see what was going on and got hit by a ricocheting bullet. But the crowd got increasingly agitated outside, and they started throwing things at the troops and at the opera house. Macready fled, like in disguise, and ultimately the captain of the militia ordered the militia to fire into the crowd. It was so packed that people didn't realize what was happening till the third volley. And when it was all over, like 24-ish people died, which is not the hugest body count, but it was the first time that anybody had fired into a crowd since the Boston Massacre, which, you know, was seen to have started the American Revolution. So really, New York City and the Eastern Seaboard freaked out, thinking there would be a sort of a literal class war going on now. And there was a rally in City Hall Park the next day with like 3,000 people went to it. And they marched on the opera house with the intent to burn it to the ground because it was a symbol of everything they hated. But the militia was very well prepared, not just with infantry, but with cavalry and with cannons. And ultimately there was just like some chanting and insults. And I think one cavalry member fell off their horse and hurt themselves, but it kind of dissipated after that. But really it was this kind of shockwave into American cultural history and social history of the time.
Now, you talk about these historical events that are, you know, recorded, and we know that they actually happened. But one of the entertaining parts of the game is also these sort of melodramatic touches, these moments where we're kind of departing from history, possibly from reality to some degree. And I'm curious about how you sort of thought about balancing sort of the strictly historical part of the game with some of those more melodramatic touches.
Well, I'll say that part of the plots and characters are drawn from melodrama. If you know Boucicault's play, The Poor of New York, which was, I believe, an 1850s play, there's some characters from that in which you kind of relive some situations from it. Badger, Puffy, and Bloodgood are all characters that I just lifted from it because I really like the play. Probably my favorite character, Nell Niblo, is actually taken straight out of a 1890s dime novel called New York Nell, the Boy-Girl Detective, which is a surprisingly good book for being 1890s trash. That said, I don't know if I really think that, I don't know, did you see Gangs of New York?
Yes.
Yeah, Gangs of New York is, you know, I think it's a fascinating movie, right? I mean, if you can get past Leonardo DiCaprio's bad Irish accent and Cameron Diaz's worse Irish accent, it's a really fun movie. It is more or less historical garbage, but at the same time, it is very accurate, or very true, shall I say, and that it really captures a lot of the spirit of that world, or at least the spirit of how people saw that world. And I generally think every single thing that happens in here, with the exception of three characters that I just made up based on students of mine in the past, everything comes from the period, either history or melodrama. The most difficult part of writing it was being an academic, wanting to have all this historical detail, right? But also knowing that I was actually writing something that people would want to play for fun. So I think I tried to find some kind of balance with it. And my goal was to have a kind of very faithful to at least what I thought history was of the time period, even if it's, the fiction and the stories and the melodramas of the time are part of that world, and it's part of people's imaginations at the time. And I didn't really see a dividing line between the two.
Yeah, I really like that you take into account sort of the larger cultural and social context of the theater world. It's not just about what plays are produced, how much money is made. I'm curious as to why you think it's kind of important to understand that larger cultural, social context if we want to understand what sort of theater of the past was like.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I can totally answer it because part of my impulse is to say, I really don't care about theater. I really care about its place in the culture and the society and what it did to people. The theater history is fascinating, and the game has like very technical details about how you're going to produce a play, how you're going to advertise it and stuff like that. But I think that, and this is, possibly the result of kind of the dominance of theater history survey courses. If you just stay within the details of like what actor did what with who and how they did it, then you miss out on the entire point of theater, which is like why people wanted to go see it and what impact it had on people. And more than anything, it's that connection that I really, really long to explore in whatever I do, really.
How does this get people to engage with the history, the context, in a way that more perhaps traditional academic approaches might not?
Well, I think number one, the basic fact is that more people might play this than would read it if I wrote a book about 1849. At least I hope so. And when I see history quite often in popular culture, media, and entertainment, I get really upset. And it's generally not because like details are wrong, right? I really don't want to bring up The Greatest Showman, which I absolutely despise and think is a vile piece of work. Although I understand some people like the music, and that's fine. When I started seeing that, my first thought was like, oh, look, like the pencils weren't like that in the 1840s. But I think that we have a responsibility as historians to communicate what history, really kind of what the nature of history is, what historical change is, and that past eras had totally different rules. And I think The Greatest Showman kind of completely flattens all the social context of that time period because it wants to see Barnum as kind of like this great sort of visionary hero. And I think because it removed a lot of the social issues, race, gender, physical difference, disability, because it removed that and just made it very like now, it communicated the idea that like history is kind of like just like now. And you really should only focus on people like P.T. Barnum, which of course, if you know anything about P.T. Barnum, like trusting him in the slightest is a really perilous task. So I really wanted to, I had to make some compromises in doing a game, and that like, I don't think that anybody is going to sort of respect you being sort of like gender neutral person in 1849 running a theater. But at the same time, I really wanted to be able to show that something like theater was in a very different place at the time, and that even though there's parallels to the politics of today, they were playing by different rules. And I think that we sort of have a responsibility to kind of treat the past as something that's not immediately accessible, that's not relatable, that takes some other tools to sort of access.
Yes, and I'm curious if you've got any future games that you're working on, if this is something that you're going to pursue in the future.
Sure. I am currently about halfway through working on an untitled game that I can best describe as The Venerable Bede Meets the X-Files, in which you play an Anglo-Saxon scribe / historian who has to investigate paranormal-ish mysteries around the year 1000. And again, it has some really hardcore, like, historical detail. There's a little more fantasy, I guess, thrown into it.
We'll post links that will let you explore the world of New York theater in the 1840s, as well as additional information about the game Broadway 1849 in our show notes. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It was great.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes. And you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.